Little girl found a German shepherd crying in the woods. What happened next left everyone crying. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a moment in time that will stay with you forever. A moment that tested the strength of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile line between tragedy and triumph. This isn't fiction. It happened. And it might just change the way you see the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story deserves to be heard. The wind whispered through the tall pines, carrying with it the low rumble of thunder far in the distance. Willow Brook, a quiet little American town, often met storms with calm acceptance, but that evening the woods felt different, charged with a restless energy, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every sound echo just a little louder than it should. Leaves rustled in uneven bursts, and for anyone listening closely, the world seemed to be speaking in half-broken whispers. Down the worn path that led into those woods wandered a child no older than 4, her tiny frame cloaked in a simple blue dress that swayed around her knees with each hesitant step. Her golden hair stuck to her cheeks in the damp air, and her eyes, wide, innocent, unclouded by the doubts of adulthood, scanned the shadows between the trees. Lily had wandered these woods before with her grandfather, picking wildflowers and chasing fireflies. But tonight she walked slower, her steps drawn by something she couldn't explain, something tugging gently at her heart. At first, it was only a sound, faint, almost swallowed by the wind. A cry. High-pitched and broken, it didn't belong to the storm. Lily froze, listening, her breath caught in her throat. Was it a bird caught in the branches? Or maybe just the creak of wood straining against the wind? But then it came again. A whimper this time, soft, desperate, and filled with a sorrow so deep that even a child could recognize it. Her small hands clutched the hem of her dress, torn between the instinct to run back toward the safety of the farmhouse porch and the curiosity pulling her deeper into the trees. Children have a way of sensing what adults often dismiss, of hearing cries the rest of the world has learned to ignore. And so, though her heart beat faster with each step, Lily pressed forward, following the sound. The woods thickened around her, branches low, roots twisting like old scars across the ground. The crying grew clearer now, fragile, trembling, fading in and out like someone too tired to call for help anymore. She stepped into a small clearing, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. That's when she saw it. Half hidden by weeds and tangled vines lay a cage, rusted, heavy, and cruel against the softness of the forest floor. Inside, pressed against the cold metal bars, was a German shepherd. His fur, once noble and proud, was now matted with mud and leaves. One paw was twisted awkwardly beneath a root, his body trembling from exhaustion. And then came the sound again, the same heart-wrenching cry she had heard in the distance. Except now it wasn't a mystery. It was his voice, broken and begging in the only way he knew how. Lily's eyes widened. She had seen dogs before, strays darting through alleys, farm dogs lounging on porches. But never like this, never so weak, so lost, so clearly pleading for someone to notice him. Her tiny steps carried her closer, until she was kneeling in the wet grass just inches from the cage. She pressed her palm gently against the bars, her breath shallow, her eyes searching his. The shepherd lifted his head weakly, his ribs showing with each strained breath. For a moment, fear flickered across Lily's face. What if he growled or snapped, like the warnings she'd overheard adults mutter about strays? But then the miracle happened. Slowly, painfully, he stretched his muzzle toward her tiny fingers and licked them, a trembling gesture of trust where most would expect only suspicion. Lily's lips parted in a small gasp, her eyes filling with tears she didn't fully understand. In her world of dolls and bedtime stories, she had just stumbled upon something far more real, a soul crying for help. The storm rolled louder above, thunder breaking the silence like a warning, but still she stayed, her dress damp, her knees muddy, her hand never leaving the cage. Behind her, the world remained indifferent. Cars rolled down Main Street, neighbors shuttered their windows against the storm, adults carried on with their evening chores, too busy to notice the faint cries drifting out of the woods. But Lily noticed. Lily had listened. And in that moment, she became the only bridge between cruelty and compassion, between despair and hope. The German shepherd's eyes met hers again, a silent plea passing between them. Something inside her tiny heart stirred, a determination beyond her years, a promise she didn't even need words to make. And that was how it began. With a storm whispering through the trees, a child in a blue dress, and a cry too fragile for the world to hear. What happened next would not only bind a girl and a dog forever, it would move an entire town to tears. The town of Willow Brook had always carried a charm that seemed borrowed from another time. Its main street was lined with weathered brick shops, white picket fences guarded front yards filled with daisies, and old lantern posts still glowed softly at night. For the seniors who often strolled there in the evenings, it was a place that reminded them of their own childhood, the laughter of children echoing by the creek, the glow of fireflies after supper, and the ever-present perfume of pine drifting in the air. Just beyond the town square stretched the woods, a thicket of tall trees and winding paths that had stood for generations, holding both the beauty and secrets of the town in their hushed silence. Lily had come to know those woods in a way only a child could. At 4 years old, with her golden hair tied loosely by ribbons and her favorite blue dress often muddied by her adventures, she was a child of wonder. Her life hadn't been easy. Her parents, lost to struggles that no child should have to understand, had left her in the care of her grandparents. They lived together in a modest farmhouse on the edge of town, a place that smelled of apple pies cooling on the windowsill and cedar wood burning in the stove. Her grandfather, a man in his 60s with calloused hands and kind eyes, was her steady anchor. Her grandmother, soft-spoken and warm, filled Lily's days with stories of faith, kindness, and the simple truth that love could heal anything. But it was Lily's heart itself that seemed to radiate kindness. Even in her tender years, she had a way of noticing the small, the fragile, the forgotten. She scattered breadcrumbs across the yard for sparrows in the morning, left bowls of milk by the porch for stray cats, and giggled when squirrels came daringly close to snatch the apples she dropped. To her, every creature was a friend waiting to be understood, every silent stare a plea for care. It was on one of those evenings, when the storm had threatened the horizon but hadn't yet broken, that Lily wandered further into the woods than usual. The air was thick with the earthy scent of rain, and the gentle croak of frogs rose from the creek that wound its way through the pines. Fireflies began to flicker like tiny lanterns, painting the dusk with golden sparks. To most, it was just another night. To Lily, it was a world alive, whispering stories only she seemed to hear. And then she heard it again, the cry. Not the fleeting whimper from the stormy night before, but closer, sharper, filled with a rawness that cut into her small heart. She stopped, the hem of her dress brushing against ferns, her breath catching as her ears strained to find the sound again. The woods, usually so alive with insects and birds, seemed to hush for that moment, as though waiting for her to listen. And then it came, a pained yelp, followed by a trembling whine. Her feet moved before she fully understood why. Down the path, across the roots, deeper into the shadows. She clutched the little lantern her grandfather had given her, its glow casting fragile circles of light across the ground. The crying grew louder until it pulled her into a clearing that time had nearly forgotten. The grass here was tall and unkempt, thorny vines weaving across broken logs. It was the kind of place adults avoided, too wild, too tangled, too full of forgotten things. And there, half hidden beneath branches and weeds, lay the source of the sorrow. A German shepherd. He was not the proud, strong creature she had seen in storybooks. His fur was soaked with mud, his ribs showed through his thin frame, and his once powerful body was pinned by the cruel weight of a fallen branch across his paw. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, and each exhale came with a soft whimper, as though the very act of breathing was pain. His eyes, dark, clouded with both fear and exhaustion, lifted when Lily stepped closer. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath again. The woods, the creek, the whisper of leaves, all faded into silence. It was just the girl and the dog, innocence and suffering, face to face in a forgotten corner of the world. Lily's small hand trembled as she lifted her lantern higher, its light brushing across the shepherd's battered frame. She could see the dirt crusted into his fur, the raw scrape of skin where a collar might once have been, the slow trembling of his limbs. He looked less like a beast and more like a broken thing, fragile, abandoned, forgotten. Her heart ached in a way words could never capture. Most children would have screamed or run. Most adults would have turned away, muttering that it was too dangerous, that such a dog couldn't be trusted. But Lily did what her heart told her to do. She took a slow step forward and then another, until she was kneeling in the wet grass beside him. The lantern sat by her feet, its glow spilling gently across the shepherd's face. She reached out with her tiny hand, her fingers barely steady. The dog's ears twitched. His body tensed. And then, instead of snapping or growling, he lowered his head ever so slightly and let out a soft whimper that sounded almost like surrender. Lily's fingers brushed against his muzzle, and to her astonishment, he licked them weakly, one trembling motion that carried more trust than any words ever could. Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, she understood something her grandmother often said, that sometimes the smallest cries belong to the souls who need love the most. The woods, once a place of mystery, became in that moment a sanctuary, a place where two forgotten hearts met. The dog closed his eyes, leaning the weight of his head against her hand as if he had finally found relief. And Lily, despite her smallness, felt something stir within her chest. A courage, a promise. A bond that would change everything that followed. The woods were no longer just trees and shadows. They were a witness, a silent cathedral holding the first spark of a story that would bring both heartbreak and healing, sorrow and hope. A little girl in a blue dress and a German shepherd crying in the woods. From that moment on, neither would ever be the same. The first drops of rain had begun to fall, speckling Lily's blue dress and turning the soil beneath her knees into dark stains. She didn't notice. Her entire world, in that moment, was framed by the thin glow of her lantern and the trembling form of the German shepherd still tangled in the vines. His weak eyes followed her every movement, not with suspicion, but with a kind of desperate hope. She couldn't explain why she knew it, but she did. He wasn't dangerous. He was just broken. From behind, hurried footsteps crunched through the underbrush. Her grandfather's voice cut through the steady hum of rain. "Lily, sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" His breath came heavy, his coat clutched around his shoulders as he pushed through the brambles. When he spotted her kneeling by the cage, his expression shifted from relief to alarm. "Good heavens!" The shepherd let out another low whine, and Lily gently stroked the bars with her small hand. "He's crying, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice almost drowned by the growing patter of rain. "He's hurt. We have to help him." Her grandfather's steps slowed. His eyes narrowed on the dog, taking in the gaunt body, the ribs showing through patchy fur, the paw pinned beneath the heavy branch. A storm of emotions flickered across his weathered face. Sorrow, caution, fear. "Lily," he said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You need to step back. Stray dogs, they can be dangerous. You don't know what he's been through or what he might do." But Lily didn't move. Instead, she shook her head, golden hair plastered to her cheeks by the rain. "He's not dangerous. He's scared. Look." She slipped her tiny fingers carefully between the vines where the shepherd's muzzle rested. The old man's heart nearly stopped as he reached to pull her back, until he saw what happened next. The shepherd leaned forward, slow and deliberate, and licked the child's hand. Not a growl, not a snap, just a trembling lick, as though he wanted to assure her he understood her kindness. Lily's eyes brimmed with tears, her lips curving in a small, fragile smile. "See, Grandpa? He trusts me." The storm cracked above them, a jagged streak of lightning flashing across the treetops. Rain began to pour harder, soaking their clothes, turning the clearing into a slick mess of mud and roots. The old man glanced at the sky, then back at the dog, torn between fear and the pleading look in his granddaughter's eyes. "Lily," he began, his voice heavy with warning. "Dogs like this, they're unpredictable. He could have diseases, he could." "No," she cut in, her small voice louder than he'd ever heard it. Her chin lifted, eyes blazing with a determination beyond her years. "He needs us. Nobody else will help him. But I will." Her grandmother appeared next, her umbrella turning inside out against the wind as she hurried toward them. "Jack, what's happening?" she called, before her gaze fell on the sight before her. Her granddaughter kneeling in the mud beside a half-dead shepherd in a rusted cage. She gasped, one hand covering her mouth. "Dear Lord." Jack, still frozen between instinct and fear, turned to his wife. "He's in bad shape." But his eyes shifted to Lily. She wants to help him. She won't leave him. The rain beat harder, trickling through the vines, dripping from the shepherd's muzzle. His whimpers grew weaker, fading under the noise of the storm. The adults exchanged a look, one filled with caution, worry, and that protective instinct that tells you to shield a child from the wild. But then they looked at Lily again, her little frame hunched forward, shielding the dog as though her tiny body could somehow guard him from the world. Her grandmother knelt beside her, setting aside the broken umbrella. "Sweetheart," she whispered gently, sometimes we can't save every creature. Sometimes it's too late." But Lily shook her head fiercely. Her hands stayed pressed against the shepherd's face, her tears mixing with the rain. "No, he's still alive. He's still trying. If we leave him, he'll think no one cared. Please, please don't make me leave him here." The shepherd's eyes fluttered shut, then opened again just enough to meet Lily's. And in that silent exchange, something unexplainable passed between them. Her grandfather saw it too, the look of surrender in the dog's gaze, paired with the fire in the child's. It was as if the dog had already chosen her, and she had chosen him. The old man's chest tightened. He thought of the many years he had lived, the things he had seen, the way people passed by suffering when it was easier not to look, the way grown men justified cruelty in the name of caution. But here, in the middle of a storm, his granddaughter reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that sometimes the purest truths come from the smallest voices. He sighed, rubbing a weathered hand across his brow. "All right," he murmured at last, his voice nearly lost in the downpour. "We'll help him. But carefully. Together." Lily's head snapped up, her eyes shining even through the rain. "Really, Grandpa? Really?" he said, his tone softening. He crouched beside the cage, inspecting the heavy lock that had rusted shut, his fingers tracing the twisted vines holding it in place. "It won't be easy, and he may not survive. But we'll try." Her grandmother fetched a lantern from her basket, holding it close so Jack could see. The storm's fury made the light flicker wildly, but it was enough to reveal just how cruelly the cage had been set. The branch pinning the shepherd's paw had dug deep into his flesh, the lock corroded but stubborn, as if daring them to give up. The shepherd whimpered again, his gaze flicking between the adults and the child. He seemed to know that his fate now rested in the fragile balance of their decision. Lily stroked his muzzle again, whispering softly, "It's okay. We'll get you out." For the first time, the old man felt the truth of her words settle in his heart. It wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about something greater, compassion standing stubborn against fear, innocence refusing to let cruelty win. The rain poured harder, thunder roared louder, and yet, in that forgotten clearing, a promise had been made. Sometimes, children see truths adults forget. And sometimes, their voices are the ones that save lives. The rain had become relentless, pelting the forest floor in thick, slanted sheets that blurred vision and soaked every inch of clothing. The old lantern hissed in the storm, its glow barely holding against the fury of the night. Yet even in the chaos, one thing remained steady, the small beam of light from Lily's trembling hands. She clutched the flashlight with all the strength her tiny fingers could muster, holding it above the cage so her grandfather could see what he was doing. She would not leave. Not when those desperate eyes still looked to her for hope. Jack braced himself in the mud, his boots sinking with each step he took toward the cage. "This lock is old," he muttered, squinting against the rain. His voice was firm, but his hands shook as he fumbled with the heavy bolt cutters. Rusted shut. Whoever put him here meant for him to stay. He bit down on his frustration, knowing his granddaughter's eyes were fixed on him, silently begging for a miracle. The shepherd let out a howl that cut through the storm like a jagged blade. It wasn't the threatening snarl of a wild dog. It was a cry of pain, raw and broken, echoing through the woods with a sound that pierced the heart. The paw pinned under the heavy branch bled freely now, darkening the earth beneath him. Every time he shifted, the vines twisted tighter, biting into his already wounded flesh. "Hold on, boy," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice nearly lost in the storm. "We'll get you out of this." The bolt cutters bit into the lock with a metallic groan, but the old iron refused to give way. Jack gritted his teeth and tried again, his muscles straining as lightning flashed across the clearing, bathing everything in a silver-blue glow. Beside him, his wife pressed her shawl tighter around her shoulders, whispering prayers under her breath. And there was Lily, kneeling in the mud, her little dress plastered against her knees, her hair dripping into her eyes. Yet she didn't flinch, didn't shy away. Instead, she leaned close to the shepherd, her voice steady though soft. "It's okay," she whispered, inching her fingers through the vines again. "We're here. We won't leave you." The shepherd responded with a faint whimper, and once again his tongue brushed against her hand. It was as if he drew his strength from her presence, clinging to that tiny thread of compassion while the storm threatened to drown out everything else. Jack cursed under his breath as the cutters slipped. "Stubborn thing," he growled, wiping the rain from his brow. The lock had fused shut after years of rust, and the vines tangled around it like nature's cruel reinforcement. He shifted tactics, grabbing the crowbar he'd brought and wedging it beneath the branch that held the shepherd's paw. His boots slid in the mud as he leaned his full weight against it. The branch creaked but held firm, as though the earth itself conspired to keep the dog imprisoned. The shepherd cried out again, his body trembling violently. Lily leaned closer, her voice breaking. "Please, Grandpa, please don't give up." Jack's chest tightened at the desperation in her voice. He pressed harder, every muscle in his aging frame screaming in protest. Still, the branch refused to move. His wife stepped forward, bracing her hands against the crowbar alongside him. "On 3, she shouted above the storm. 1, 2, 3. Together, they heaved, mud sucking at their boots, rain blinding their eyes. The branch groaned under the pressure, shifting just enough to make the shepherd whine louder, his paw bleeding fresh into the dirt. "Almost there," Jack shouted, his arms trembling violently. "Hold steady." And then, with a crack that echoed through the clearing, the branch finally snapped free, rolling aside into the mud. The shepherd collapsed instantly, his body too weak to hold itself upright. He sprawled half in the cage, half out, ribs sharp against his skin, his breathing ragged and shallow. Lily gasped, dropping the flashlight as she scrambled forward on her knees. "He's free," she cried, her voice breaking with joy and relief. She pressed her small hands to his fur, ignoring the mud and blood that stained her palms. "You're okay now. You're safe." Jack fell back into the mud, exhausted, his chest heaving. His wife steadied him, her own tears mixing with the rain. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the storm above and the labored breathing of the shepherd as he tried to lift his head. He managed only a weak movement before his muzzle sank into the mud again. But Lily was already there, sliding beneath him, lifting his head gently into her lap. She cradled him as though he were no heavier than one of her dolls, her tiny frame trembling from the weight but refusing to let go. The shepherd let out a long, shaky breath. His eyes fluttered half-closed, but when they opened again, they locked onto hers. And in that gaze was something no words could capture: relief, gratitude, trust. His ribs rose and fell unevenly, each breath a battle, yet his head stayed nestled in the crook of her lap as though he had finally found a place of rest. Jack swallowed hard, his vision blurring. In his long years, he had seen men hardened by war, neighbors broken by loss, but he had never seen anything as pure as the sight before him. His granddaughter, soaked to the bone, cradling a dying dog with a love so fierce it seemed to challenge the storm itself. The rain poured harder, drumming against the earth in relentless rhythm, but inside that clearing, time seemed to pause. Lily stroked the shepherd's head with delicate fingers, whispering through her tears, "You're not alone anymore. I found you. I won't leave you." And the shepherd, broken as he was, seemed to understand. His tail, weak but still alive, gave the faintest wag against the mud. In that fragile moment, amid thunder and tears, a bond was born. The storm eased by dawn, leaving the world washed and quiet, as if the heavens themselves had spent the night weeping. Mist clung to the fields, curling low around the farmhouse and barn, carrying the scent of wet hay and earth. Jack's boots squelched in the mud as he carried the wounded shepherd across the yard, his muscles aching from both exhaustion and worry. The dog was heavier than he expected, but there was no weight in this world he would not carry for his granddaughter's sake. Lily trotted at his side, her blue dress still damp from the night before, tiny hands clutching the hem as she tried to match his strides. Her eyes never left the shepherd. He lay limp in Jack's arms, ribs pressing sharp against his skin, breath wheezing faintly with each movement. His paw, raw and bleeding from the vines, left a faint trail of crimson along Jack's sleeve. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, calmer. The smell of hay, leather tack, and old wood created a comfort Lily had always known. Jack laid the shepherd gently on a pile of clean straw, covering him with a wool blanket. The dog stirred slightly, opening his eyes just enough to see Lily kneeling beside him, her face full of worry. His tail gave a faint twitch, then stilled. Jack crouched, pulling out the old veterinary kit he hadn't touched since his retirement. His hands, though slower now, still remembered the motions, threading a needle, cleaning wounds, binding gashes. But as he reached for the antiseptic, the shepherd whimpered and tried to push back, his gaze flicking anxiously between Jack and the girl. "He doesn't trust me," Jack muttered, frustration mixing with guilt. He had spent years healing animals, yet this one recoiled from him like a stranger. But Lily leaned forward, her voice soft as a breeze. "It's okay," she whispered, pressing her small palm against the shepherd's side. "Grandpa will help you. You're safe." Something in her tone, the innocence, the certainty, seemed to ease him. His tense body relaxed, and though his breathing remained shallow, he stopped pulling away. Jack worked carefully, cleaning the wounds, bandaging the bleeding paw. Every time the shepherd whimpered, Lily hushed him with soft words, her tiny fingers stroking his matted fur. When Jack finally sat back, sweat clinging to his brow, he sighed. "That's all I can do for now. The rest," he glanced at his granddaughter, seeing how her small hand rested protectively on the dog's chest. "The rest is up to him." The hours crawled by. Rain still dripped from the barn roof, tapping rhythmically onto a bucket in the corner. The shepherd refused the food Jack set near him: fresh broth, softened bread, scraps of chicken. He turned his head away, eyes dull. But when Lily sat beside him, cross-legged in the straw, something shifted. The shepherd lifted his head slightly, watching her with those weary eyes. His nose twitched, and when she placed her small hand near the bowl, he sniffed at it, hesitated, and then lapped weakly at the broth. Jack watched in quiet astonishment. "He'll only eat if you're with him," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Lily smiled faintly, her damp lashes catching the dim light. "He's scared," she said simply, "but he knows I'll stay." Day after day, the pattern repeated. Jack would tend the bandages, his wife would bring fresh water, but the shepherd's trust remained tied to one person, the little girl in the blue dress. He would not eat unless she was beside him. He would not rest unless her hands stroked his fur. He would not calm unless her voice whispered through the shadows. And Lily gave him all she had, patience far beyond her years, compassion untainted by the world's cynicism. Sometimes she hummed lullabies, soft tunes her mother once sang to her before bedtime. The shepherd's ears would twitch, his tail tapping faintly against the straw, as if each note stitched together the frayed threads of his spirit. Jack noticed things others might have missed. Rope burns around the dog's neck, scars hidden beneath his fur, the raw indentation where a collar had once been fastened too tight. Marks that spoke of cruelty, of a life chained and forgotten. He looked away quickly, his jaw clenched, his heart heavy with anger he couldn't voice in front of Lily. But she didn't see scars. She saw only someone who needed love. One afternoon, as the sun broke timidly through the clouds, Lily leaned close to the shepherd, pressing her forehead gently against his. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she whispered. Her voice trembled slightly, as though she were speaking not only to him, but to herself. The shepherd responded with a faint wag of his tail, weak yet deliberate, the first true sign of trust. It was as if he had been waiting all along, not for medicine, not for food, but for kindness that expected nothing in return. Jack watched from the stall doorway, his hands resting heavily on the frame. He thought about the long years of his life, the way men often sought solutions in strength, in logic, in medicine. Yet here was his granddaughter, no taller than his knee, showing him what he had long forgotten. Healing doesn't always come from a doctor's hands. Sometimes it comes from the smallest hands of all. That night, the barn glowed with lantern light. Lily sat curled beside the shepherd, her tiny body nestled in the straw, her voice barely above a whisper as she sang to him. The shepherd closed his eyes, his breathing deepening, his body finally surrendering to rest. For the first time since they had found him, peace settled across his face. Jack covered them both with a blanket, his chest tight with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had worried that Lily's heart, so tender and scarred from her own losses, might break further under the weight of this rescue. But instead, he saw something miraculous. Her wound seemed to mend as she mended his. The barn was quiet, save for the soft hum of a child's lullaby and the rhythmic rise and fall of a dog's chest. Outside, the night stretched vast and silent, the storm finally gone. And in that silence, trust was forged, not with words, not with medicine, but with love that neither cruelty nor fear could extinguish. Word of Lily's discovery did not stay hidden for long. In Willow Brook, secrets never lasted. They slipped from porches to corner stores, from whispers at the church steps to quiet conversations at the diner. By morning, the town was buzzing with a mixture of sorrow and outrage. People shook their heads in disbelief as they passed one another on Main Street, their voices thick with both compassion for the child and anger for the cruelty she had uncovered. At the bakery, Mrs. Green handed out loaves of bread with trembling hands, muttering to anyone who would listen that no heart with a shred of decency could leave an animal caged and crying in the woods. By afternoon, neighbors began arriving at Jack's farmhouse, some carrying food, others bringing old blankets, many simply showing up with nothing more than their presence, a silent statement that the child in the blue dress and the broken dog were not alone. The barn became a place of pilgrimage. Each visitor who peeked inside gasped at the shepherd's condition. His fur patchy with mud, his ribs standing out like brittle branches, his paws raw from struggling. Some looked away, unable to stomach the cruelty. Yet all were moved when they saw Lily crouched at his side, whispering softly, her tiny hands smoothing the dog's scarred coat. With her there, he was calmer. With her there, he wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a survivor. That sight lit something in the town, a sense that even against cruelty, innocence could fight back. But compassion was not enough to answer the darker questions. Sheriff Douglas, tall and stern with a weathered face, came that evening. He walked the path into the woods where Lily had found the cage, his deputy trailing behind with a lantern. The rusted bars lay half-sunken into the earth, the weeds crushed by desperate struggles, and the lock, thick and heavy, still hung on the broken door. The sheriff crouched, fingers brushing the damp ground where boot prints pressed into the soil. "This wasn't nature," he said grimly. "That cage didn't just fall here. Someone placed it. Someone wanted him to die." Jack felt his stomach tighten, his jaw clench with anger he hadn't let himself feel until now. Behind him, Lily clung to his coat sleeve, her eyes wide and frightened. She looked from the cage to the sheriff and whispered, "Why would anybody do that?" Her question, so pure and honest, cut through the night air. None of the adults could answer. Over the next few days, the sheriff dug deeper. More prints were found near the creek, a torn scrap of leather tangled in the brush. He recognized the lock as the type sold in bulk for kennels. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together into a pattern darker than anyone in town wanted to face. For years there had been rumors of men who bred dogs for fighting, who traded them like cards and discarded them when they lost their value. It was whispered in hushed tones, dismissed with a shake of the head because no one wanted to believe such cruelty lived so close. But now the proof lay in that rusted cage. One evening, the sheriff returned to the farmhouse. His lantern swung in the growing dark as he told Jack what he had learned. "It's Carl Dixon," he said, his voice low. "We've suspected him for a long time. Runs a farm out past the county line. Dogs come and go. Some bred for fighting, some traded, most never seen again. The shepherd, the scars, the way he flinched. I'd bet my badge he was one of Dixon's." Jack's chest tightened. Inside the barn, Lily knelt beside the shepherd, her small fingers threading through his fur as she hummed a tune. The dog's tail gave a faint thump against the straw, and Jack thought of the contrast. A man who had thrown him away and a child who gave him back his dignity. The sheriff's words spread like wildfire. At the diner, men slammed their coffee mugs down, voices thick with anger. At the church, women prayed aloud for the animal's recovery and for justice to come swiftly. But beneath the outrage lay a cold undercurrent of fear. Dixon was a hard man with a reputation. If he realized the shepherd had survived, if he thought the dog could expose him, what might he do to reclaim what he once owned? Jack noticed signs already: tire tracks near the woods that didn't belong, the sound of an engine on the back road that vanished when he stepped outside. One neighbor whispered across the fence, "Be careful. That man won't take kindly to being exposed." The words stuck with Jack like a shadow he couldn't shake. Yet inside the barn, the world was different. Lily refused to let fear dictate her actions. One night, as rain pattered gently on the roof, she pressed her cheek against the shepherd's neck and whispered, "They can't take you away. You're safe here." The dog exhaled a heavy breath, resting his head in her lap, as if sealing the promise between them. The town began to see her differently too. Old Mr. Harris at the feed store shook his head in wonder. "That little girl reminded us of something we've all forgotten, that kindness is stronger than cruelty. We walk past suffering every day, but she stopped. She listened." Soon people were leaving scraps for strays, speaking out against animal mistreatment, even volunteering to help at the small shelter Jack had once run half empty. Compassion had become contagious, all because a child refused to look away. But no matter how the town changed, the shadows remained. The sheriff warned Jack to keep the doors locked and his shotgun close. Dixon had not been seen, but whispers suggested he was angry, and angry men rarely stayed quiet for long. Willow Brook stood at the edge of something bigger than itself, a confrontation between cruelty and innocence, between greed and compassion. And at the heart of it all was a little girl in a blue dress and the dog who had chosen to trust her. The rusted cage in the woods had been meant as an ending. Instead, it became the beginning of something larger, an awakening for a community, a bond between a child and a wounded soul, and the first spark of a fight that was far from over. The people of Willow Brook waited anxiously, hearts torn between hope and dread, wondering when the villains who had abandoned the shepherd would come back to claim what they had once thrown away. The days that followed were unlike anything Willow Brook had seen in years. In the little barn behind Jack's farmhouse, the once broken shepherd began his slow climb back toward life. At first, he hardly moved, lying curled in the straw as if every breath cost him more strength than he could spare. But with each passing day, and with Lily's constant presence, small changes began to bloom. His ribs still showed, his paws still bore the scars of struggle, but his eyes, those weary, haunted eyes, grew a little brighter. The first time he tried to stand, his legs shook so violently Jack feared he might collapse again. But Lily was there, her tiny hand pressed against his chest as if her touch alone could hold him steady. "You can do it," she whispered, her voice carrying the confidence he lacked. And somehow he listened. By the end of the week, the shepherd had taken his first wobbly steps toward the water pail, Lily's giggle rising like music behind him. That sound, the laugh of a child who had been quiet for too long, stirred something deeper than any storm had done. It wasn't just the dog healing, it was Lily too. Since her parents' struggles had left her in her grandparents' care, shadows had lingered in her eyes. She had played less, smiled less, carrying a loneliness too heavy for someone so small. But now, with the shepherd padding beside her, she began to laugh again, those full, bubbling laughs that made the walls of the old farmhouse feel alive once more. Neighbors noticed the change first in her. Mrs. Green from the bakery swore she hadn't heard Lily laugh like that since the spring fair 2 years ago. Old Mr. Harris nodded knowingly, saying, "That dog gave her back her childhood." And with every story passed along, more neighbors came to see for themselves. They brought food for the dog, scraps of meat, loaves of bread, jars of broth. Farmers came with sacks of grain for the barn. Children arrived with blankets stitched by their mothers, and one neighbor, a retired carpenter, began building a sturdier shelter beside the barn. "If he's going to stay," he said, hammer echoing across the field. He deserves a roof as strong as the love that saved him. The barn soon became a gathering place. Families lingered long after they dropped off supplies, drawn by the sight of a child in her blue dress playing with a shepherd who now wagged his tail when she called. Some evenings, people stood in silence, watching as Lily tossed a ball of rags across the yard, and the shepherd, though still limping, bounded after it with determination. When he returned, tail thumping, she would wrap her arms around his neck, her laughter spilling into the twilight. And every time, the onlookers felt something stir in their own hearts, a reminder of what kindness could do, even in the smallest of hands. It wasn't long before whispers began calling Lily by a new name. At the general store, a woman sighed and said, "She's the guardian angel of that dog." At church, the pastor spoke from the pulpit of how innocence could heal wounds no medicine could reach. In the woods, he said, cruelty left its mark. But in our town, love answered louder. Soon enough, the phrase stuck. Lily, the guardian angel of the woods. The shepherd, once abandoned and left to die, had become more than an animal. He was a symbol of loyalty that refused to break, of survival against odds that seemed impossible. Children in town began drawing pictures of him at school, their crayons coloring him with shining fur and bright eyes. Parents pinned those drawings to refrigerators, not just as art but as reminders. Men who once shrugged at stray dogs now bent to leave scraps. Women who had turned their eyes from rumors now spoke out, their voices firm with conviction. One evening, as the sun dipped low and fireflies began to dance above the fields, Jack looked out across his yard. Dozens of neighbors stood together, some leaning on fences, some gathered near the barn door, all united by one story: a little girl who refused to walk away and a dog who refused to give up. He felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched Lily kneel in the grass, the shepherd resting his head against her lap. The sight had become familiar, yet it never failed to move him. Around him, he heard sniffles, saw neighbors brushing tears from their eyes. Tough farmers, weary mothers, curious children, all bound together by the miracle of compassion. That night, as the crowd slowly dispersed, a hush settled over Willow Brook, but it was not the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of hearts carrying the same story, a story they would repeat to their grandchildren, a story that would linger like a gentle echo in the pine woods for years to come. And though danger still loomed in whispers, the shadow of men who had once owned the shepherd, the town felt different now. Stronger, united. They knew cruelty had walked among them, but they also knew that kindness, once awakened, could never be silenced. At the heart of that kindness stood a child in a blue dress and the loyal shepherd who followed her every step, their bond a living reminder that love is not just an emotion, it is a force that can heal, inspire, and transform an entire community. Sometimes, it is the faintest cries that carry the loudest truths. In a world where so many voices are ignored, it was the soft whimper of a German shepherd in the woods that awakened an entire town. From that moment, Willow Brook was no longer the same. A community that had grown used to silence and routine now found itself moved by the bravery of a child who refused to walk away. The shepherd's loyalty, his willingness to trust despite scars that spoke of cruelty, became more than just the story of a dog. It became a lesson that devotion and love can outlast pain. The little girl in the blue dress showed what many adults had forgotten, that innocence is not weakness, and that compassion, when given freely, can turn cruelty into hope. She reminded everyone that healing does not always come from medicine or laws, but from kindness, from small hands that reach out where others turn away. The scars on the shepherd's body would never fully disappear, but in the warmth of a child's love, they no longer defined him. Instead, they became reminders of survival, of the strength it takes to endure and the grace it takes to forgive. And so, Willow Brook carried forward a story that would be told for years to come. A story of love that healed wounds deeper than scars, of loyalty that never faded, and of a child's compassion that turned sorrow into hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in loyalty that never fades. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from.